We open on May 1st and we're open until October 31st, 9 to 5 every single day. We're the only place on earth where you can see all 15 species of cranes in one location. And we did recently undergo a $10 million renovation. So we look brand new. If you visited us before, we look a little bit different, but we're still quite an exciting place to go to come see some cranes. But for this program today, I'm going to be talking about the cranes over Illinois. So in this program, I'll talk a little bit about the International Crane Foundation, give you kind of an idea of who we are, some of the work that we're doing, introduce you to those 15 species of cranes, and talk a bit about what makes a bird a crane. And then I'll really dive in on those two cranes that you find here in Illinois, the sandhill crane and the whooping crane. And I'll give you some tips, tricks, and pointers on how to identify these birds in the wild by sight and by sound. And also talk about some of the spaces that these birds live, talk a little bit about their history, some of the historic threats that they faced, some of the threats that they currently face. I'll touch on those human-wildlife conflicts with sandhill cranes and that whooping crane reintroduction program that we're working on to help bring whooping cranes back to the North American landscape, and talk about ways that you can get involved and help to protect the cranes in your own community. So to start, the International Crane Foundation, also called ICF, works worldwide to conserve cranes in the ecosystems, watersheds, and flyways on which they depend. The International Crane Foundation is headquartered in Baraboo, Wisconsin, and is located within the ancestral homeland of the Ho-Chunk people. As an organization, we acknowledge and honor the Ho-Chunk people as caretakers of the land and water since time immemorial, and as our neighbors, friends, and vital members of our community. The International Crane Foundation is dedicated to amplifying local voice and perspective in all of the places where cranes dance. And pictured here, we have all 15 species of cranes. And at first glance, you can see that there's a lot of similarities between these birds. The first thing being that they all have very long beaks, small heads, and necks. And with these lengthening features, you can probably gather that these birds are relatively tall as well. And a lot of that height in these cranes is coming from these incredibly long legs. And these long legs are really necessary to help them to wade through those deep water wetland environments that all 15 species of cranes are dependent on to some degree. You'll also see a lot of repetition of colors between them. Many cranes are going to have black, white, red, and gray on their face. The only crane we see that doesn't have that is going to be our blue crane, also called the Stanley crane, and of course they have blue on their face. And cranes can also be found around the world. You can find them on 5 out of 7 continents. The only spaces that we're not going to find cranes is going to be South America and Antarctica. But here in North America, we have 2 species of cranes, both of which can be found in Illinois and both of which can make their way through DuPage County, which is quite exciting. And that's going to be our sandhill crane and our whooping crane. So our sandhill crane, they're one of the most common species of cranes found around the world. I'd venture a bet that everybody here is at least a little bit familiar with the sandhill crane. Maybe you've seen them, maybe you've heard them, maybe you've heard of them, maybe you've even had them in your own backyard. On the very opposite end of the spectrum here in Illinois is going to be one of the rarest and most endangered species of cranes, and that's the whooping crane. I will say, though, that for cranes being listed as threatened or even listed as endangered, like our whooping crane, that isn't uncommon. 10 out of the 15 species that we work with are listed as threatened or endangered, and they're really facing various threats. And these can be due to poaching, they can be due to habitat loss, they can be due to diseases, the pet trade, and more. But again, today we're just going to focus on those sandhill cranes and those endangered whooping cranes. Starting first with the sandhill crane. And before we dive into their history, again, I'm going to take that step back and really familiarize you with these birds. My goal being that you can comfortably identify these birds when you encounter them, especially as they make their way up on their migration here soon. So the sandhill crane, it's always good to start with what sandhill cranes sound like before talking about what they look like, because they have a very distinct call. It's a rattling karoo karoo. And also with sandhill cranes, their call can carry for miles. So oftentimes you're going to hear sandhill cranes long before you see them. And I have 2 calls that I'm going to play for you now from the sandhill crane. The first call is going to be the guard call. This is a call that you're probably most familiar with. This is a call you'll hear on migration. Typically, if you startle a crane, if you see them in your yard and they do kind of a call at you very quickly, this is going to be the call that they'll make. The next call that we have for the sandhill crane, this is a unison call. This is typically done on breeding territory, and it's kind of an overlapping cacophony of sounds. You're going to hear 2 birds calling at the same time. They might do this after successfully defending their territory, after copulating with their mate, or when they're trying to strengthen that pair bond with their mate. And I'll play that call for you now too. So sandhill cranes, they also have some pretty distinct physical characteristics as well. They stand at about 4 feet tall, and when they're in flight, they're going to fly with that long head and that long neck stretched out in front of them, and those long black legs trailing behind them. At the top of their head, you'll see a featherless red patch on the crown, kind of an orange or amber eye, a long, sharp black beak, and then they're going to have sort of slate gray or reddish brown feathers throughout their entire head, neck, and wings. So you'll see when looking at the sandhill crane that coming about halfway down the neck, we see it's gray, and then we start to see that reddish brown. And oftentimes here in the Midwest, we get asked, well, what about the gray sandhill cranes? What about the red sandhill cranes? Do we have two different subspecies out on the landscape? Is it a breeding plumage and a non-breeding plumage? And the answer is a little bit stranger than you might think. So here I have a close-up of these sandhill crane feathers. On the top are those red sandhill cranes, and on the bottom are those gray sandhill cranes. And you'll see when we look really close at these feathers that some of them appear to be very nice and intact, and those are those slate gray ones. And the ones that are kind of that rusty red, those appear a little bit more weathered and more worn. So when sandhill cranes return to their breeding territories, just a little bit north of you in Wisconsin and in kind of the northern edge of Illinois, they're going to be returning in about late February, early March. When they're coming back to wetlands that aren't that lush green cattail. Instead, they look kind of like that picture on the top, that sort of dead brown vegetation. And at that time, our sandhill cranes, they're going to be breeding, they're going to be establishing their territories, they might even be building a nest. And in order to increase their survival during that time, they really want to make sure that they can camouflage in with their environment. So sandhill cranes are very smart in that they take mud from wetlands and they paint it all over their feathers. And that mud is really rich in iron, so when air hits it, it oxidizes the feathers and turns them sort of this rusty color. The second crane that we have here in Illinois is going to be the whooping crane. Same with the sandhill crane, we'll talk a little bit about what they sound like first. And with the whooping crane, they actually get their name, the whooping crane, because of the very loud, distinct whooping-like call that they make. You'll hear it's very different than that kind of rattle that we heard with the sandhill crane. So for this first call, we're going to play a guard call. And for a whooping crane, it sounds almost like a single note shout. And in this one, you'll hear one bird shouting and another bird responding right after. And the second call that we have, that's again going to be that unison call. So you hear two birds calling at the same time. Whooping cranes also have some pretty distinct physical features. They stand at 5 feet tall, making them the tallest bird in all of North America. You'll see that they also have those long black legs, and they have this prominent white plumage throughout their entire body. You also see one big difference right away is that this whooping crane is walking through water, whereas our sandhill crane was in kind of a prairie environment. Whooping cranes tend to be much more wetland dependent than our sandhill cranes are. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that sandhill cranes can paint their feathers and camouflage in with their environment, whereas whooping cranes are this bright white bird. So they're not able to camouflage to avoid predators. And instead, one thing that they do to avoid predators is they actually head out into deeper water, because that deeper water can sometimes deter animals like raccoons, coyotes, or foxes that could be a predator to our whooping cranes. We'll also see on our whooping crane that they have a featherless red patch on the crown of their head. They have a black mustache-like mask on their cheeks, a bright yellow eye, and kind of a grayish yellow beak. When they're in flight, they're also going to fly with that long neck outstretched in front of them and those long legs trailing behind them. They have an impressive 7 to 8 foot wingspan, and at the very tips of their wings, you'll see these prominent black wingtips. And that's really important for a large white bird like a whooping crane, because when they're undergoing migration or they're flying long distances, the feathers that are going to run the risk of the highest wear and tear or even breakage are going to be those at the very tips of your wings. And if those feathers are white, they're not very strong. But if they are black, that means they have more melanin in them. If they're a lot stronger, they're much less likely to break. Unfortunately, that does mean that there are some other large white birds like the whooping crane out on the landscape that have these prominent black wingtips, making it just a little bit more difficult to identify whooping cranes. And I have some of those birds pictured here. You can see birds like egrets and herons. They look very similar to cranes when they're on land, but when they're in flight, they're going to fly with that neck coiled up into an S, whereas our cranes fly with it outstretched. And then on top here, we have some of those birds that have those prominent black wingtips that make it a little bit harder to identify whooping cranes compared to these birds. The bird that I see most often misidentified as whooping crane is going to be the American white pelican. And at first glance, you might think they look quite different, especially because pelicans have a smaller neck and shorter legs. But both pelicans and whooping cranes, they fly pretty high up in the air. And the higher up a crane is, the harder it is to see that really thin neck and those really thin legs. So you're really just looking at a body and wings at that point. And one way that I tell them apart is that our pelicans have black on the tips of their wings, and it also runs along the underside of their wings. Another bird that can be commonly mistaken for whooping crane is, of course, going to be our sandhill cranes. These two birds look very similar. We like to call them cousins here in the Midwest because they share so many physical characteristics. But again, our sandhill cranes are going to be just a little bit shorter, and they're going to have a brown or gray or red throughout their entire body and wings, whereas our whooping cranes are white with black wingtips. Of course, it does make it a little bit more difficult to identify a whooping crane compared to a sandhill crane when we have juvenile whooping cranes out on the landscape. And that's this bird that's pictured right here in the middle between the two adults. This whooping crane juvenile right here, this is going to be what a whooping crane juvenile looks like in the fall after it hatches. And that's especially important for your area because whooping cranes that are on their migration from Wisconsin and heading south, many of them are going to be cutting straight through your area. So you could see whooping cranes that look like this, that are 5 feet tall, have kind of a cinnamon color on their head, a sort of white and cinnamon throughout their body, and kind of a pink gray beak, a blue eye, and then pinkish gray legs. So you can see here how they look just a little bit more similar to a sandhill crane in this scenario. We'll shift focus here a little bit and talk now a little bit about the history of these cranes, starting first with the sandhill crane. And I like to call the sandhill crane a conservation success story. So in the 1940s, sandhill cranes were almost completely extirpated to the east of the Mississippi River, so much so that this scene that we see here, a marsh without cranes in it, unfortunately became common. At this time, Aldo Leopold believed that cranes could be completely lost from the Midwest altogether, as he wrote here in Marshland Elegy saying, "The sadness discernible in some marshes arises, perhaps from their once having harbored cranes. Now they stand humbled adrift in history." So sandhill cranes, they were pretty quickly removed from the landscape, ultimately due to unregulated hunting and habitat loss. And this had a pretty massive impact on sandhill cranes because of their life history. And when talking about the life history of sandhill cranes, it's important to note that this life history is not unique to sandhill cranes, but it applies to all 15 species of cranes. And as you remember, like I said before, 10 out of the 15 species we work with are listed as threatened or endangered. And some of that comes down to their life history. So the first thing to know about sandhill cranes or cranes in general is they're a pretty long-lived species. In the wild, sandhill cranes have been documented living into their 30s, and in captivity, they can live to be much older. At the International Crane Foundation, we once cared for a Siberian crane. His name was Wolf, and he lived to be 83 years old. So on top of being an incredibly long-lived species, they're also pretty slow to reproduce. They typically only lay about 1 to 2 eggs each year. They'll sit on those eggs for about 30 days. And they'll hatch oftentimes just one chick called a colt, and then they'll raise that colt through the entire summer. They will migrate down with them in the fall. They'll spend the winter with them, and then they'll come back with that colt in the spring back to their breeding ground, at which point they will then separate from that colt. That colt will join a non-breeding flock of juveniles until it's about 3 to 5 years old, and then it'll find a mate of its own and fall right back into the same breeding cycle of laying just 1 to 2 eggs each year, hatching just one chick, and that chick not breeding on its own until it's about 3 to 5 years old. So animals with these sorts of life history characteristics are often greatly affected by losses to their population because it's incredibly hard for them to rebuild from those losses. But I did say that sandhill cranes are a conservation success story, and you may be wondering, well, where are they now? And sandhill cranes can be found across North America. There's today an estimated 800,000 sandhill cranes in the world, and they're one of the most abundant crane species in the world. As you can see here east of the Mississippi River, we do have quite a few sandhill cranes as well. There's about 90,000 in that area. And in Illinois, you can expect to see about 40,000 to 50,000 sandhill cranes every single year. You can also see by looking at this map that they have a massive range, and that range is continuing to expand and grow eastward. We're also seeing, you can see here the green is the breeding area. We are starting to see that breeding area for sandhill cranes expand south. So you should expect to see more sandhill cranes breeding in northern Illinois as the years go on. So today there are 6 subspecies of sandhill cranes. 3 of them are migratory. We have our lesser, our Canadian, and our greater. Here in Illinois, you're just going to see the greater sandhill crane. We also have 3 non-migratory sandhill cranes, the Cuban, the Florida, and the Mississippi. So while as a species, sandhill cranes are not federally listed and they're considered to be relatively common, that doesn't mean that all populations of sandhill cranes are stable. We know that the Cuban and the Mississippi sandhill crane are actually listed as endangered. The Florida sandhill crane has been slowly declining in recent years. And in some Western states like California, sandhill cranes are actually listed as state threatened. We do want to focus here on Illinois, where sandhill cranes are considered to be relatively common. And I want to share with you kind of a density map showing where sandhill cranes can be found throughout the year, moving month by month. Starting first here with January, you'll see that there are some sandhill cranes that are remaining in your area through the winter. The majority of sandhill cranes are just a little bit east of you, spending their time over in Indiana throughout the winter. But then moving into February is when we actually start to see sandhill crane migration begin, which seems a little bit early compared to some birds. You'll start to see that large group of sandhill cranes making their way along southern Lake Michigan, coming through your area. And then in March, this is when we can expect to see kind of that peak spring migration for our sandhill cranes. And on migration, we know that sandhill cranes still fly only during the day, flying around 200 miles each day using thermals, which are those kind of circulating, rising, warm updrafts of air, and essentially makes it so that our sandhill cranes can continue to fly forwards while expending less energy on their migration. Moving into April, we start to see that migratory movement peter out. Our birds have now started to return to those breeding areas. They're establishing territories. They're not moving as much. And you see that some sandhill cranes are going to remain in your area, but the bulk are going to be just a little bit north of you. Coming here through the next few months, this is really going to be breeding time, kind of stagnant movement. We might have chicks on the ground, so we're not seeing our cranes taking off too much. And then coming into September, you start to see just a little bit of migratory movement. You can see just east of you, this really dark orange or red dot right there in Indiana. That's Jasper-Pulaski Fish and Wildlife Area. That's going to be your closest area to see kind of that big migration or big gathering of sandhill cranes just outside of Illinois. But you'll see in October, that migratory movement starts to peak again, with the largest bulk coming again here right through November, with the birds really curving along Lake Michigan and heading into Indiana during the winter months. And we still see some of that movement in December as well. So in Illinois, sandhill cranes are predominantly found on two types of landscapes. We're going to find them in wetlands, we're going to find them in agricultural fields. And they're going to use both of these landscapes because they provide ample access to food resources, water, and they are relatively flat landscapes. So in wetlands, our sandhill cranes are going to eat things like crayfish, fish, frogs, snakes, roots, tubers, berries, really anything that they can get their beak on. And in agricultural fields, we'll see that sandhill cranes will eat things like invertebrates, small rodents, and waste grains. And in addition to these two landscape types, you can also see sandhill cranes may venture into towns where they can find foods such as bird seeds or even the chips like they're eating in this park right here. And you might even see them in your own backyard. So the rebound of sandhill cranes we've seen is really due in part to their adaptability to this human-dominated landscape. So historically, as you know, Illinois would have looked very different than it does today. We would have seen a state filled with fertile prairies and wetlands that would have been very hospitable of cranes. However, since the 1800s, Illinois has lost over 90% of its historic wetland acreage. And as you can see by looking at this map here, many other Midwestern states like Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, some of those places that would have been very hospitable to our cranes were also similarly impacted. So as we know, sandhill crane populations, they did decline drastically by the 1940s, but their populations have since regrown to astounding levels as they've become adapted to using agricultural landscapes, wetlands, parks, prairies, and more. That being said, though, sandhill cranes do continue to be threatened by this continued urban expansion and land conversion to agriculture, as they do still depend on those wetlands and river edges for roosting habitat at night, because that water does afford them protection from those terrestrial predators. But we will see them spending a little bit more time in agricultural fields or prairies than you may find whooping cranes spending time in those spaces. It's also important to note that this adaptability to human landscapes for our sandhill cranes doesn't come without its consequences. So with this rebound of sandhill cranes and their increasing use of human-dominated spaces, we're also seeing an increase in human-wildlife conflicts with sandhill cranes. And those include things like crop depredation, collisions with vehicles, and even property damage. And this is incredibly concerning for the future of sandhill cranes. So the International Crane Foundation has been working to manage these issues and find some long-term solutions, such as encouraging communities to not feed cranes. This can be a huge issue, especially if you're in an area that has a lot of sandhill cranes in your community, and even if they have chicks with them too, as these are going to be our flightless birds. because we're seeing that if you're feeding sandhill cranes in your backyard, it's really encouraging these birds to continue to cross the road and come into communities, and puts them at a higher risk of being hit by a car in those situations. Another thing that we might suggest to help mitigate some of these human-wildlife conflicts is covering vehicles with tarps or parking your car in a garage if you find that breeding sandhill cranes in your neighborhood are particularly aggressive towards their own reflection, like we can see in that picture there. Another thing that we've done is we've helped to develop bird repellent seed treatments known as Avapel to combat the issue of crop depredation that we see with sandhill cranes, predominantly just a little bit north of you in Wisconsin. All right, so we'll shift gears again and we'll talk now about the whooping crane, which is quite a different story. I like to call the whooping crane a story of perseverance, cooperation, and creativity, as this is a conservation effort that is still being played out on our landscape. So historically, whooping cranes would have had a massive range. This range would have expanded as far north as the Arctic. You can see they would have been breeding up through the northern Midwest. We would have seen whooping cranes breeding in northern Illinois as well. They then would have migrated really through the bulk of the United States and then spent their winter months in places like central Mexico or coastal Gulf of Mexico. At this time, pre-European expansion, it was predicted that there were over 10,000 whooping cranes in the fertile wetlands and prairies of North America, but by the 1940s, only 20 whooping cranes were left in the wild, and they faced near extinction at this point. And you may be wondering, well, what caused this decline of whooping cranes? And unfortunately, there are many factors that contributed to the decline of whooping cranes, the first of which is unregulated hunting, which we can see in this picture here. We have a man with a whooping crane that he has hunted on display, and right above it are 2 sandhill cranes as well. So when European settlers moved into these spaces, these fertile wetlands and prairies that our whooping cranes were using, these areas were lush with resources, but unfortunately at this time, game laws are mostly ignored and they were rarely enforced. And this really led to unrestrained hunting, destruction of wild areas that ultimately grew into the 1800s and led to the extinction of some species that we could have seen today. Unfortunately, as whooping cranes were hunted off of the landscape, their numbers dropped, they became more scarce, and with that, their value increased. And with that increase in value, we saw another increase in hunting of whooping cranes, as well as an increase in the collecting of whooping crane eggs, simply for the value of having them. And as we know from the life history of sandhill cranes, which is very similar to that of whooping cranes, taking eggs off of the nest and hunting adults out of the population is incredibly detrimental for this population's survival or even growth. Because they are so long-lived and they're so slow to reproduce, it's really hard for this population to rebuild following these losses. Unfortunately, there were additional factors at play, another one of which was the millinery trade, or essentially the trade for bird feathers, which are used to adorn women's hats for fashion at this time. And some of the most sought-after feathers are those of very colorful birds, or those of very large white birds like the whooping crane, which could make some of these large white plumes like the one that's pictured here. But luckily for the whooping crane and the many other species that we see today, some high society women from Boston, they noticed this issue and they formed the first Audubon Society, which was the Massachusetts Audubon Society, and it banned the trade of wild bird feathers. The final massive contributor we have here that contributed to the decline of whooping cranes was habitat loss. And this habitat loss was largely driven by the Homestead Act of the 1860s. And this act essentially encouraged people to rapidly move out west, and in doing so convert hundreds of thousands of acres of this fertile wetland habitat or this prairie landscape that our whooping cranes and even our sandhill cranes depended on as well, which took away a very valuable resource for cranes and many other wetland dependent species. But when people began to notice not only the decline of whooping cranes, but the loss of some more common birds in wild spaces, resulted in a series of laws to protect whooping cranes, some other birds, and protect these spaces as well. And the first of these laws was in 1918, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. It still exists today. It essentially protects birds from illegal take. So taking of their eggs, taking of their feathers, their nests, taking of the birds themselves. Some of those big things that impacted our whooping cranes early on. In 1934, we saw the passage of the Duck Stamp Act. If you're familiar with waterfowl hunting, or you might be a hunter yourself, you might be familiar with the Duck Stamp Act. Essentially, it's a federal art competition to design this stamp, which is then sold to hunters to hunt on federal lands, and that money is recirculated right back into conservation. It still exists today, and it's raised over $850 million to protect 6.5 million acres of wildlife habitat. In 1966, we saw the creation of the refuge system, and this is incredibly important for whooping cranes because it set aside large tracts of land for wild animals to use. And for whooping cranes, this is important because they maintain massive territories. A pair of whooping cranes can maintain a territory of about 1,000 acres in size, so they really do depend on this National Wildlife Refuge land, and they're not typically a bird that you would see in your backyard. In 1972, then, we saw the passage of the Clean Water Act. This is important because it revolutionized the protection and restoration of aquatic habitats like the wetlands that our whooping cranes depend on. And finally, in 1973, we saw the passage of the Endangered Species Act. At this time, whooping cranes were immediately listed as endangered. There were only 70 whooping cranes living in the wild, and whooping cranes are still listed as endangered today. So today, whooping cranes are found across 4 distinct populations. The first population you can find them in is a historic population known as the Aransas wood buffalo population. This is what remains of what used to cover most of North America. So that original map that I showed you that covered most of North America has since been reduced to a single flyway, and that's the one that's furthest to the west. They're going to spend their breeding months up in Canada at Wood Buffalo National Park, migrate through the Central Flyway, and then spend their winters at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in coastal Texas. In the 1990s, we started our first reintroduction for whooping cranes. We reintroduced a non-migratory flock in Florida, and then we reintroduced a second non-migratory flock in Louisiana in 2011. And right in between those two, in 2001, we reintroduced the Eastern Migratory Population, or the EMP, and that's one that we're going to focus on for the rest of the talk, is that's the one that makes its way through Illinois each year. So the EMP was essentially a collaborative effort to reintroduce whooping cranes to Wisconsin that would migrate to and from Florida each year. Today, we're not seeing that population go as far south as Florida in the winter, and instead we're seeing that many will spend their winters in northern Alabama at Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge. We also get quite a few that are spending their winters in western Indiana at Jasper Pulaski and Goose Pond, and we're also seeing many whooping cranes that are starting to spend their winter months in eastern Illinois as well. For breeding area, we do still see those whooping cranes return to Wisconsin each year, though a few will venture out and spend their summer months in places like Michigan or Minnesota as well. But I want to share with you a little bit about the whooping crane reintroduction process to give you kind of a more intimate glimpse at this conservation effort that's happening again in your own backyard. So Illinois didn't see whooping cranes for many years. It wasn't until 2001 again that they were reintroduced to the Eastern Flyway. And the International Crane Foundation and Crane Conservation Partners, they've worked pretty hard to reintroduce whooping cranes to Illinois through a captive rearing and release program that uses some of the following practices that I'm going to talk about. It is really important to note, though, that this program is still in use, as the eastern migratory population is not self-sustaining. So this eastern migratory population does depend on the International Crane Foundation to keep putting birds out on the landscape and have a pretty heavy hand in the management and monitoring of this population. And there are quite a few steps to this process of reintroducing a whooping crane for the wild, but for simplicity's sake, we'll say that the first step is going to be breeding these captive birds, which we ultimately do through artificial insemination, pictured right here, the main goal being to increase genetic diversity for healthy wild populations and healthy captive populations. When we're talking about a species that went from 10,000 down to 20 birds, that's a pretty severe genetic bottleneck, and the only way for these birds to be healthy is for us to have that genetic diversity. So after these birds then lay those eggs, they're incubated for about 30 days, and they hatch chicks, and those chicks are raised in one of two methods. The first method that we use to raise these chicks for release in the wild is probably the most natural, the most obvious. This one is parent rearing, and this is where we have birds that will sit on those eggs, hatch those chicks, they're going to raise them, teach them everything they need to know about how to survive in the wild, and then those chicks are released out into the wild once they reach fledging age, or when they can sustain flight and head down on their migration. However, at the International Crane Foundation, we are often hatching and raising more chicks for release than we have parents that live in captivity that can sit on those eggs or even raise those chicks. So this is where our second method comes in, and this is called costume rearing. And pictured here is the costume that we use to raise whooping cranes, and at first glance, it does look pretty ridiculous. But when you break down the anatomy of the costume, you can see why it works. And the reason that we use this costume is because whooping cranes exhibit this very unique trait called imprinting, and imprinting is where a young bird learns its identity by looking at that of who's raising it. So if you raise a whooping crane, looking, sounding, acting, talking like a human being, that whooping crane isn't going to learn its identity to be that of a whooping crane. It's not going to make smart decisions out in the wild. It might not associate with the correct habitats. And when it reaches breeding age, it's definitely not going to want to breed with other whooping cranes. So it's not going to help that population grow. So it's incredibly important that throughout our practices, our whooping cranes know that they are whooping cranes. And when they're released out in the wild, they can make safe decisions and they can find other whooping cranes and they can help build that population in the wild. So that's why we use these costumes. When you break down the anatomy, you can see how it starts to look a little bit like a whooping crane. So you have a biologist wearing it, so you get the height of a whooping crane. They're covered completely in white. That gives you kind of the large white body. Your left arm is going to act as your wing. Most of the time it's tucked, but if you want to run around and flap your wing, you can pop that out and you'll see that prominent black wingtip. Then your right arm is going to act as kind of the long neck of the whooping crane. And at the top, we have a puppet head. And on the puppet head, you can see that featherless red patch in the crown, black mustache-like mask, a bright yellow eye, and that sort of grayish yellow beak. It's also important that our biologists act like whooping cranes. They spend a lot of time foraging on the ground with this costume, drinking water, standing alert, running around and flapping their wings, some of those typical whooping crane behaviors you might see. And then it's also important that they sound like a whooping crane too, because whooping cranes can also imprint on sound. So it's important we don't speak around them, and instead we have a small tape recorder that broadcasts this contact call, the whooping crane. And this is kind of a soft purring call. It's a call an adult whooping crane would make when talking with their chick. And it's not something you're likely to hear in the wild because it is relatively quiet, but I'll play this one for you now. So once our whooping cranes are raised either by adult whooping cranes at the International Crane Foundation or by these costumes, it's time for them to be released out into the wild. And they can be released in many different ways. The one that's pictured here is a soft release. So this is where we put them out in a wild wetland. They're put in a temporary pen. They're given time to acclimate to it. And over time, that pen is slowly taken apart until they're completely out in the wild. So as you can see by looking at this process, it is pretty time consuming, but it's also very expensive as well. The entire process of breeding, hatching, raising, releasing, and then monitoring one whooping crane out in the wild costs about $100,000 per crane. So it is very expensive, but it was necessary to bring whooping cranes back to the eastern United States and build another population as well. So once these birds are out in the wild, it is important that we continue to follow through with our reintroduction efforts. We continue to monitor this wild population. So all birds that are released into the eastern migratory population are given a unique combination of color bands, and that's going to be some combination of white, green, red, and black. And then many of them are also given a radio tag as well. And that's that kind of stick-like thing that's hanging off the leg of this whooping crane on the far left here. So our team of scientists at the International Crane Foundation, as well as volunteers along the flyway, they track these whooping cranes and they use this information to essentially further research and knowledge about whooping cranes. We also, though, depend very heavily on reported sightings from the public or from citizen scientists along the whooping cranes flyway to gather information about where these birds are at, what habitats they're associating with, their survival, if they're spending time with other birds, all of that information that can help us to understand what the long-term survival of this population is going to look like. So we do ask that if you see a whooping crane in Illinois, look for those colorful bands on their legs. We'd love to hear from you and we'd love to see where the birds are at. So the first step to reporting a banded whooping crane to the International Crane Foundation is to first confirm that you saw a whooping crane. And again, you can use that first part of the presentation, looking at some of those features: tall white bird, red on their head, black on their cheeks, black wingtips, flew with their neck out and their legs behind them. You can also head to whoopermap.savingcranes.org to see if there are any whooping crane sightings reported in your area. So where you live, again, you're right in kind of that migratory pathway for sandhill cranes, but that's the same path that we're seeing whooping cranes take as well. So you should see the most movement between February and March for that spring migration of sandhill cranes and whooping cranes. And then you can also see that movement again coming through October and November and a little bit in December as well, when we're starting to see those sandhill cranes and whooping cranes make their way south then at that point. So if you want to head to whoopermap.savingcranes.org during that time, you can see the counties that whooping cranes have been spotted in, and you can then report your sighting by either clicking Report a Banded Whooping Crane or go to bandedcranes.org. And we ask you to share with us the exact location that you saw the birds. If you saw those colorful bands on their legs, even if you saw just one leg, it really helps us narrow down who the individual might be. If you have a picture, that's really important too, or if you have any other information about their behaviors, the habitat they were using, any other birds they were associating with, that's pretty helpful to us as well. We do ask, though, that if you spot whooping cranes, you don't share that very exact location information out with friends, family, or on social media. These birds are endangered and they are very sensitive to disturbance or harassment, so we want to make sure that we're keeping them safe from that. If you do want to share any information, you can share what county you saw them in. As you can see on the Whooper map here, that's about as much information as we share out as well. But I also want to share with you that from citizen science reporting, we've learned that most whooping cranes, again, are not flying as far south as Florida, and you can really see that exemplified on this map here. And you can see some of those spaces that I told you before, whooping cranes may be spending their winter months. So right over here in southeastern Illinois, we're starting to see some whooping cranes there as well. And you can see those spaces that they're occupying in Indiana too. And for whooping cranes in the eastern migratory population, all of them will make their way through Illinois on their migration. We'll see about a third of them are going to go kind of straight through the center of the state, and about 2/3 are going to cut through your region as well. I do also want to note that this information and these maps right here, this is all publicly accessible information on our website through our monthly whooping crane eastern population updates. You can either follow that on our website, subscribe to our news, or you can head onto our Facebook and see when those pop up, as they're posted every month right around the first of the month. But finally, I do want to share with you another really cool citizen science reporting that we got at the International Crane Foundation. And in 2016, we heard from a Sam Burkhart in Illinois, and he told us that he observed 30,000 Sandhill cranes flying over downtown Chicago. And when he zoomed into that group, you can see right in there that there were 4 whooping cranes that were flying with them as well. So in this first picture on the left, we have a Sandhill crane, and then a juvenile whooping crane. And then on the picture on the right, we have all Sandhill cranes on top. On the bottom, we have an adult whooping crane, a juvenile whooping crane, and an adult whooping crane. So we're really grateful to Sam for sharing this whooping crane sighting with us, not just because we love to hear from citizen scientists that want to share these sightings with us, but because downtown Chicago is really not the place you expect to see one of the rarest and most endangered birds in all of North America. So today, across all of the wild and captive flocks of whooping cranes, there are about 800 birds. You can see in our eastern migratory population, there's about 76. And again, Illinois can expect to see all 76 either coming through central or coming around that Chicagoland area each year on migration. And in just about 70 years, we've really seen a significant recovery of this species. And this story is really proof that by working together, scientists, governments, and communities can really save a species from the brink of extinction. Our work, however, is not done. This eastern migratory population is growing, albeit very slowly. You can see on this graph here, this black line, this is the total number of individuals in the eastern migratory population. And you can see that it started to drop in recent years. You can also see when you break down additions and losses to the population in recent years, those losses in red have started to outnumber additions in green. And that's due to various factors. The first of which is COVID-19 had a pretty big impact on our ability to do our costume rearing. So you can see in 2020 and 2021, we really don't have as many individuals added to the population. We've also really slowed our release efforts in our eastern migratory population as we focused recently on helping to build that Louisiana one. So all of the birds we were raising in the International Crane Foundation, many of them were going down to Louisiana to help that population grow. That population is now about equal size to our eastern one. So we should hopefully see our eastern population grow as well. But another reason that we've seen this population decline is because of some of those human-caused losses. And the one that I want to talk about today is going to be this threat of poaching. So in these spaces that we're seeing whooping cranes using in our eastern migratory population, unfortunately, they are facing the threat of poaching. And as an organization that's working to reintroduce whooping cranes out in the landscape and safeguard their future, there are a few things we want to understand about poaching. We want to understand where is it occurring, who is causing it, and why is it happening. So the International Crane Foundation launched a study of whooping crane poaching, and ultimately what we found was that poaching greatly increased following the reintroduction of our 2 non-migratory and our 1 migratory population. So you can see here in this graph on the left, we have yellow as our historic population, orange is our Florida population, gray is our eastern one, or the one that comes through Illinois, and then blue is our Louisiana population. And following the reintroduction of these populations, we're really seeing that massive spike in poaching incidents within these populations there. We then want to know who is causing these poaching cases. So we investigated them, and what we found was that these cases were largely unrelated to hunters or cases of mistaken identification. In a few cases that were related to hunters, what we found was that these hunters were hunting before legal hunting hours when identification is difficult. And one would argue then that that person is no longer a hunter, they're now a poacher, because a poacher is somebody who doesn't follow hunting regulations. So unfortunately, this picture here does represent a typical situation in which a whooping crane shooting might occur. And I want to note that I actually took this picture of whooping cranes on private property in central Illinois. So you can see here, these birds are on an agricultural field, they're on private property, they're not too far from the roadside. More often than not, these shootings are occurring on private property and from the roadside, sometimes even with the person shooting from inside of the car using a high-powered rifle. So this entire act is highly illegal, and the person who's committing this act is considered to be a vandal, again, not a hunter who made an honest mistake. And one of the poaching incidents that we know about was committed by a man named Jeff G. Blatchford. He was a 25-year-old man in South Dakota, and in 2012, he shot an adult male whooping crane and a hawk. And when he was asked about shooting these birds, He said he did this sort of thing all the time. He admitted to shooting hawks off of power lines and shooting ducks in ditches, but then he said, "I have never shot an eagle." And that's a pretty interesting response because he wasn't asked if he had shot an eagle, but he wanted to make sure that we knew he wouldn't do that. And that might be for two reasons. He may want us to know that he doesn't shoot eagles because he may be aware of the pride his community and his country has with eagles, seeing as it is our nation's bird, or he may be aware that you can get into a lot of trouble for shooting eagles, which are protected under the Golden and Bald Eagle Protection Act and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So this pride and this awareness of penalties that exists for eagles and really aids in their protection doesn't necessarily exist for whooping cranes today, but could be pivotal to their long-term protection. So we've been addressing this pride and this awareness for whooping cranes, ultimately through community outreach programs with K through 12 students, outdoor recreationists, birders, hunters, naturalists such as yourselves, and more across the whooping crane flyway since 2015. And we've been working with these communities to share with them the story of whooping cranes, the threats that they face, and ultimately ask them to be advocates for whooping cranes by spreading our message and inspiring others to care for whooping cranes and be our eyes and ears on the ground for reporting poaching and harassment of whooping cranes. So you can see here on this map, we have the darker states are the states where whooping cranes have been spotted, and blue are poaching incidents before 2015, and yellow is after 2015 or after the implementation of our whooping crane outreach program. And you can see that the number of poaching incidents has greatly decreased, but we do really want to focus still on doing our outreach efforts in these spaces where the whooping crane poaching incidents have occurred, but also in these spaces where whooping cranes are continuing to expand into, as these are going to be communities that we haven't had outreach activities with in the past or haven't built communities that give a whoop there yet. And one of the spaces that we really want to be focusing on in these coming years is going to be Illinois. We haven't done a lot of outreach activities there, but we're increasingly seeing more and more whooping cranes spending their time in Illinois. So we do want to be focusing our efforts here to make sure that we can eradicate whooping crane poaching as a cause of mortality for them. So following all of this, you may be wondering, well, what can I do to help cranes? Unfortunately, there are many things that you can do to help protect whooping cranes and sandhill cranes. The first thing being, know how to identify cranes and safely look for them on the landscape. So in looking for cranes on the landscape, we ask you to remember to give them their space and stay at least 200 yards to 2 football fields away from them at all times. We ask that you don't share where these birds are at on social media. Again, information more specific than the county that these whooping cranes are in. We ask that if they're on public property, remember to stay on the trail, park in designated parking areas. And if they're on private property, remember to respect private property. If you see banded cranes, report that to bandedcranes.org. And if you see any sort of poaching or harassment of whooping cranes, report that to local authorities. Other ways you can protect cranes is by talking to your friends and legislators about cranes and wetlands in your state. Conserving that habitat for cranes is incredibly important for making sure that they continue to visit your state in the long term. As we talked about before with sandhill cranes, one way that you can keep them safe in your own community is by not feeding them in your own backyard. Other ways that you can get involved in helping to protect cranes is by getting involved in our Midwest crane count. And I have that on my next slide, a little bit more information about that count that's coming up. And then finally, you can head to our website, savingcranes.org, to learn a little bit more about some of the work that we're doing, some ways you can get involved, or you can sign our pledge, which I will drop a link for, or I'll email it out to Wendy or Pat to share with everybody after. And by signing this pledge, you're essentially saying that you are committed to helping protect whooping cranes in your own community, and it'll give you some updates pretty infrequently about some of the work that we're doing to help protect whooping cranes around North America and maybe in your own community as well. But before we wrap up here, I do want to share with you a little bit of information about the annual Midwest Crane Count. This is a citizen science effort that we have every single year. And the one that's going to be coming up this year will be Saturday, April 15th, 2023, from 5:30 in the morning until 7:30 in the morning. This annual count is done in plots that are organized by a county or a community coordinator. So if you're interested, you can head to our website, savingcranes.org, find out what the coordinator is closest to you, and they can get you set up in a plot to count cranes. So we don't have too many coordinators or too many counters each year in DuPage County, so we're always looking for more people to get involved. Last year, they counted only 15 sandhill cranes. We didn't have too many people out counting, but the year before that, we did count 42 sandhill cranes. Even if you don't count sandhill cranes in your plot, it is a pretty good time to get out, spend a good sunrise out in a prairie or in a wetland, and you can see some other cool wildlife, maybe spot some plants too. And if you're lucky, see some cranes as well. All right, so I do want to open it up to any questions that you have for me, and I want to thank you all again for joining me on this presentation as well. So thank you.
Well, Stephanie, we were not overwhelmed with questions in the chat. I'm going to take that as a good sign because of such a clear and complete presentation.
Yeah.
Oh,
I do have
one did just pop in. Do you see it? Is there a significance to the specific band colors?
Yeah, so it depends on population. So in our eastern migratory population, it's going to be that red, white, green, or black. For each individual bird, it tells us what their identity is, but from the public end, there's no real significance about like age or gender or anything. None of that is really displayed in those bands. But it is really helpful for in the South. We've had some of our non-migratory Louisiana birds have either popped over into the eastern population or into the Aransas wood buffalo population. And we can quickly tell them apart because they have these bright blue bands on their legs.
I had, there's a question about the different species of cranes, asking if they occur naturally in Baraboo, but they're all over the world, are they not?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do actually get that question pretty frequently. So we have all 15 species of cranes at our site, and that's part of the reason why our site is only open during the summer months, is because some of those species are coming from pretty warm climates. So when they stay at the International Crane Foundation year round, they're only going to be outside when it is hospitable to what would be normal in their natural climate. And then they have kind of indoor spaces that they live during the winter. So they do live there year round at our site in sort of exhibit areas, because we do operate as a zoo and a breeding facility too. So they're not going to be, out in the fields, out in the prairies. They don't migrate to and from. They're not found naturally in North America.
But if people would like to see what each species looks like, they can see them in real life up in Baraboo at the Crane Foundation.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that we did that was pretty exciting with our renovation was we actually had some pretty new technology put in for some of that fencing that they put in, or building in moats. So it's pretty easy to see the birds, and there's not really any sort of obstruction in your way when you're looking at them. It's not like a normal fence, or we have kind of moats in the way. So it's like an open air environment. But the birds, they aren't able to fly out. They can't come out towards you, but you get kind of almost like the experience like you were with them out in the wild with the way that we built our exhibit spaces. But they are captive birds there.
Frank would like to know, do they overwinter in southern Illinois?
Yes, we do have some whooping cranes that will stay in southern Illinois. It's not at the very far tip down there, but it is kind of where southern Indiana touches Illinois. We see quite a few whooping cranes that spend their winters right there.
Yeah, I didn't know if he was asking about the Sandhill Cranes or the whooping cranes.
Sandhill cranes, not quite as many. We'll see a few Sandhill cranes pop over. More of them are going to head a little bit further south into Alabama or Kentucky or Tennessee. The whooping cranes, though, are the ones that we see kind of pushing over into Illinois a little bit more frequently.
I wanted to mention that I'm getting reports from friends that they see Sandhill cranes throughout the entire summer in this area. My cousin lives west of Elgin, and she says that they're there all summer long. She lives right off of a bunch of farm area, and that they walk around and seem to like it there. Then they leave. Then they leave during the migration. I thought at one time they were all north of here, Wisconsin and farther north. But I guess that they're becoming more ubiquitous. Yeah,
I'm not quite sure where Medewin Prairie sits in relation to where you're at, but we did have a pretty exciting chick hatching at Medewin Prairie this year, which is one of the more southern areas for the Sandhill Crane breeding range here in Illinois, which is pretty exciting to see.
Yeah, that's just a little south of where we are.
Okay.
Quick question, someone asked, do Sandhill cranes sleep standing or do they lie down on the ground? A
little bit of both. It really depends if there's water in the way. And And with our captive cranes, they also act just a little bit different from the wild ones. So a lot of our captive sandhill cranes, they're going to hunker all the way down and lay down every night. But it sometimes just depends on if there's water, or there's dry ground. They can do both.
Yeah, I was wondering too if they roost in trees like herons.
Oh, that's a good question. So cranes, sandhill cranes and whooping cranes and most cranes can't roost in trees. So on their feet, they have 3 really long toes facing forward, and then their back toe is actually incredibly short, so they can't grip on the trees. The 2 that throw it off are 2 African crowned crane species. They have really long back toes, and they will actually roost up in trees. But here in North America, if you see a long-necked, long-legged bird in a tree, it's not going to be a crane.
There's an interesting question, and I'm not sure that it's that you continue, you still do this, but it says, how do you teach introduced cranes to migrate?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our eastern migratory population was actually taught how to migrate by following an ultralight airplane. So it looks kind of like a combination between an airplane and a kite. And we would have pilots that were wearing that same whooping crane rearing costume and broadcasting that call. And they would spend time with the chicks before they're about to be released. They would get acclimated to that airplane, get comfortable with it, imprint on it to a degree. And then they would fly down kind of following this plane, and they would make regular stops, show them all the different wetlands that they could stop in, drop them off for the winter, pick them back up in the spring. So they did that from 2001 until 2016. It was stopped in 2016 for a pretty good reason, being that we had enough whooping cranes out in the wild that now we can do that soft release, or we can even do a direct autumn release, where we just send these fledglings out near adult whooping cranes that are about to take off on migration, and they're just going to follow those birds and head down south with them.
Right, the ultralight's been retired, right?
Yes, absolutely.
The presentation about is about cranes over Illinois. The question here is, they mostly fly over the central and eastern counties, or do they show up all the way west to the Mississippi?
Yeah, so for sandhill cranes, the answer is really no. They're really going to be along kind of those eastern counties. Many of them are just in Illinois to kind of follow along Chicagoland and then pop over into Indiana and head down. For our whooping cranes, it's a little bit different. Our whooping cranes that head down to Indiana, or to Alabama, sorry, they come right through Rockford and they head straight down and then pop over into Alabama. The ones that are going to be in Indiana, they again curve right through Chicagoland. And then we have a pair of whooping cranes each year that spends their winter months actually just outside of St. Louis, Missouri, right on the Illinois side. So we do have one pair that's over there. They've been doing it year after year after year. And that picture that I actually shared of those whooping cranes out in that field, that's that pair. I took that out in Western Illinois.
Oh, do they come back every year, the same pair?
Yep, yeah, they come back to the same spot every single year. We're not quite sure how they found the spot. No cranes taught them it, no people taught them it, but that's where they want to spend their winters.
I know you had mentioned that Jasper Pulaski Reserve area in Indiana is a great place to see sandhill cranes congregating. Do they, during the migration, have other roosting spots or resting locations that they stop over at regularly that might be not quite as far a drive for us to see them?
For sandhill cranes, I'm not quite sure. So in your area, you do get some of those breeding sandhill cranes. So there's not going to be as many that are going to stop over on migration. And for whooping cranes, they fly through pretty quickly. They can complete their migration even to southern Indiana from Wisconsin in a day if they really get good weather. So sometimes the whooping cranes won't even stop. I would say Jasper Pulaski is probably going to be the closest area to see a really big congregation of sandhill cranes. And I'm not quite sure. Yeah, I think that one's going to be the closest, because the other option to see those like really big, almost the size of Kearney, Nebraska size congregations of sandhill cranes would be a little bit north of you, heading towards kind of Sauk City area in Wisconsin along the Wisconsin River. So those are going to be those They like to call Jasper Pulaski kind of one of the wonders of the world for sandhill cranes. Jasper Pulaski, Kearney, Nebraska, and then Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge in Alabama are some of the places to see the most sandhill cranes all at once.
I was down in Florida one time visiting in the winter, and I was surprised to wake up in the morning and walk outside and there were sandhill cranes walking around the yard. And this is just a typical suburban town.
Yeah, we see with that's got to be the non-migratory Florida sandhill cranes. We'd like to have the amount of community care and love that exists for those Florida sandhill cranes and those small communities to be what we see for whooping cranes, because some people feel very, very protective of those birds and really want them around. So much so that they're a little bit, they're pretty comfortable.
A person had a question about, do all the crane species mate for life?
Yes, all of them theoretically for life. So if they go through that whole strategy of finding a mate and bonding with them, they go through a lot of behaviors pretty regularly to strengthen that pair bond with that one individual. And they spend that fall migration, winter, and then that spring migration with them. So they don't just meet back up every year at breeding time. They'll stay with them through the entire year, every single year. Unfortunately, of course, sometimes a mate passes away. Sometimes there's predators, diseases, something happens, and we will see that birds will repair after that. It doesn't typically happen right away. Sometimes it can take a few years, sometimes it doesn't at all, but we do say theoretically they do mate for life.
There was a question about seed repellent. I remember you saying something about it, but I don't recall what you said. Is that put out by farmers to keep the cranes out of their fields?
Yeah, so it's mostly used just a little bit north again in Wisconsin, because we do see that when sandhill cranes are coming back to Wisconsin, they're coming back after migration. They're pretty ravenous at that time, and they really like corn seed because it's very starchy. It just gives them that pretty quick energy. And at that time, when sandhill cranes are back in the fields, we're not seeing, tall corn crops. We're seeing the corn was just recently planted. There's just a little bit of green, and that seed hasn't dissolved yet to become kind of a root at that point. So what's happening is that this little seed with little sprout is kind of acting like a flag. And we see that sandhill cranes come back to these fields and they just start plucking the corn seed out. And it can result in a pretty big crop damage loss to some of our Wisconsin farmers. So we see that Wisconsin farmers want to be able to protect their crop, protect their livelihood. So by putting this seed repellent on it, it's essentially just a taste repellent. It's actually pulled from that, you guys might know it a little bit better than me off the top of your head, but that natural toxin that plants create to make them essentially not tasty or inedible to animals. So we created something that was similar or derived from that. So it can be coated on the corn seed when it's planted, and it breaks down when it becomes a root. So it's not toxic to human beings, but it just doesn't taste good to our cranes. We do see that in Wisconsin, they do grant depredation permits. So if sandhill cranes are causing a lot of damage on their property, there are permits that are granted for sandhill cranes to be shot in those instances. But of course, you do need that depredation permit to do so, and it is something that is a pretty hotly debated topic in Wisconsin right now as well.
I wanted to remind people that if they wanted to unmute themselves, they're welcome to also ask a question and not just type it into the chat. There's most of the all the questions in the chat we've covered. Does anybody want to ask any? Not seeing any, and I'm not hearing any.
I did get one question that was a direct message. To me, it says, are the structures the only thing that keep the cranes, so the ones at the International Crane Foundation, from flying away, or do we clip their wings? And we do clip their wings, and that's just kind of like taking those black feathers on the whooping crane, and we just trim it, and it makes it so that the birds can't really take off. So it's kind of like cutting your hair. It's not vascularized. It doesn't really affect the bird in any sort of painful way, but they can't essentially get that balance, get that lift to fly away. We don't just do it to keep them at the International Crane Foundation. We actually do that for all of our birds that are in bonded pairs to help to control breeding. So if we have two birds that are a bonded pair and they continue to breed with each other year after year after year. We're just putting the same genetics out into the population. So our birds do form bonded pairs, but by clipping their wings, we're able to better control the genetic combinations and then use that artificial insemination to increase diversity and have healthy populations.
Well, Stephanie, thank you for your presentation today. I think everyone found it interesting. We had a high water mark of 59 participants, which for our Zoom meetings is at the high end. So a lot of interest in cranes, and we enjoy seeing birds. And of course, we're a native plant organization, but plants are just in the middle of everything else. So we kind of extend out beyond just plants. So thank you, and thank you everyone else for joining us today.